Welcome, everybody. We have a very special talk today from Professor Eszter Hargittai, who is a professor at the University of Zurich in the Department of Media and Communication, and she also holds the chair in Internet Use and Society. She has been part of CITP since before I was part of CITP. She got her PhD from Princeton in sociology and has done so much profoundly influential work over the years. One thing I've learned from her work is that the seemingly simple question of how do people use the internet is actually really rich and complex. And there are many narratives about this which are actually contradicted by the evidence that she unfailingly brings in her work. And all of this has profound implications for policy and how we design digital tools and spaces and so forth. She did some of the very early and important work on digital divides, and since then she has done so many amazing things. We're going to hear today about her latest book, which I'm very excited about. And also on the CITP vein, I'll say that she's been very generous with her time over the years, been a mentor, friend, colleague, collaborator to many of us. Also spent a year as a visitor a few years ago. So we're very glad to have her back here today. She's won many awards, accolades, and recognitions, but I'm sure you'd rather hear from her, and I don't want to cut into her time, so over to you.
Thank you so much, Arvind. That was very generous. So I'm visiting from Switzerland, so I brought some chocolate. I hope there's enough to go around. There are a lot of you, which is wonderful. If you have nut allergies, you should probably skip it though, because they're manufactured in nut facilities, even if they don't have nuts. So I'll send this around. Great, so today I'm going to be talking about my book, Wired Wisdom, How to Age Better Online, co-authored with the wonderful John Palfrey, and I will say a little bit more about how this came about. First, I wanted to just give some context of who I am, since this is an interdisciplinary audience. It's wonderful to see some very familiar faces, which is great, but I also see many unfamiliar faces, which is also lovely. So for some of you, you know this, but I wanted to include it for those who don't. So this is where I am on this cartoon. I think it's a wonderful depiction of different fields, and so I just wanted to signal where I am. And since I am speaking at Princeton, I thought I'd bring in this picture, especially this week, since we're celebrating the 125th birthday of the graduate school. And I did get my PhD here at Princeton in sociology in 2003. And Brian Kernighan, whom many of you should know, or all of you should hopefully know, is also a grad alum. And he was actually, even though he was not officially affiliated in any way with my dissertation, he was actually quite helpful with some things in how I was analyzing my data. So I think it's a good symbol of the interdisciplinary work that has been going on at Princeton in this domain for quite some time. I will say that I was, in fact, as a graduate student, part of the precursor to CITP, which we called GWA, which stood for Group Without an Acronym. So there you go. So I was also very fortunate to get to be involved in these interdisciplinary conversations already back then. So as Arvind said, today I will be talking about my book, and this is the table of contents. I will draw a little bit on the adoption chapter, the safety and security chapter, the misinformation chapter, and the lessons learned for different communities. My personal favorite is actually the learning chapter, but I'll leave that for folks to explore in the book. So to give you an overview of today's talk, I'll start by discussing why it is that it's worthwhile studying older adults and tech, and how I came to it and how John and I came to writing this book together. Then I'll talk about what methods we use to study technology use, yes. Then I'll bust some myths about age and technology use, as there are quite a few out there. talk about social media uses and older adults just at some basic level, talk about misinformation, and then recap. So I'll start by saying that even though many studies you'll see that look at age differences will cut off at 65 plus for older adults, we actually go with the definition of 60 plus, which comes from the United Nations and also the World Health Organization. So that's where we do the cutoff, but as I'll explain throughout the talk, it's actually really not helpful in this day and age when there are so many people over 60 who are in fact quite different, to group all older adults into this 160 plus category. And one of the big takeaways for me from this project, and I hope for you, is to disaggregate, in fact, within that group into 70 plus, 80 plus, so, well, 70, 79, 80 plus, those kinds of categories, and I'll give you examples of why. So when did I start studying older adults and why? Well, many years ago, I was actually studying younger adults, and this is partly because at the time, younger adults were much more likely to be online. And so if you wanted to get into the details of differences in people's usage, you got data about them. And so partly because I was getting data about younger adults at the time, but also as a professor who I personally get older every year by a year, but my students stay the same age. And so it's an interesting way to follow along whether there are changes or not. And one of the things that I continue to notice is that despite the public rhetoric of how these are digital natives and they know I think about technology, this wasn't the case at all. If you are working with students all the time in the classroom, you know this. And so I thought, okay, well, why all these assumptions, and let's look at this empirically. Are there skill differences? And a lot of my work, and then over time, others' work across countries confirmed this as well, that there are lots of skill differences even among young adults. Then, as older adults started to get online more and more, we saw a lot of public rhetoric focus more on them, but still in this negative light of how older adults are clueless, they're hapless, they don't know what they're doing. And just like I had thought for younger adults that the public rhetoric was too simplistic, I also felt that the rhetoric about older adults was likely too simplistic, especially as time has gone on and someone who's 60 today was 40 when the internet was already diffused into the workplace. And so someone who's 40 who used the internet at work, there's no reason they would be that clueless about technology. And so I wanted to see what has been done scientifically about this age group and technology. So with my colleague Amanda Hunsaker, we did a review of the literature at the time. So this was published 2018, so probably up to research up to about 2016 or 17. And we found that the research was basically almost entirely about just whether older adults are online, right? Like so little of it was what are they doing? How are they incorporating digital media into lives? It was this very, very basic, are they online or not, and does that matter? And I thought, okay, well, this isn't gonna get us very far. And so I started doing research about older adults. So what methods can one use to study older adults or internet use by anyone, frankly? And one could probably use any method, but I have used internet interviews and surveys and have found these helpful, especially their combination when possible. And so we started with interviews because interviews are helpful when you're not yet sure what you would include on a survey because you just don't know much. And so between the last couple of weeks of 2018 and the first 2 months, so right before COVID of 2020, we did 118 interviews with adults 60 and over in 7 countries. So who can name the 7 based on the flags? Eventually the group gets it together, but it's rare that anyone knows all 7.
8 is Croatia.
Not quite, but close.
Serbia?
Serbia, yeah, okay, so let's start on top. United States,
France,
Netherlands, Hungary, Serbia. Yes, very good. And then Turkey. Yes, so the reasons are not that deep for why we picked these countries. It's where I had people on my research team from, so we had the language knowledge. We weren't doing comparative work. It was really just to diversify the samples that people include, because almost all studies, or so many studies, are based on Americans or a few other countries, and we really wanted to hear voices from elsewhere on different dimensions, and I can get into that later. But so we did get a lot of interviews. This is a lot. And so started publishing on this material, looking at the qualitative data, and I had all sorts of findings, for example, about where people get support, where older adults get support with their technology use, among other things, finding that they often turn to each other or could turn to each other. Well, actually, they don't too often turn to each other. They sometimes turn to each other. They could turn to each other more often because many of them are actually quite skilled, but because of the public rhetoric that they don't know technology, people don't turn to older adults. And so, I think this is a missed opportunity, for example. So this is one of the costs of stereotypes, is that you remove potentially helpful people from support giving. And then, so we looked at all sorts of dimensions, and that one of them had to do with misinformation, where we introduced this idea of the misinformation paradox, and I will talk about this later. There have been studies that show that older adults may have been more likely to share fake news in the 2016 elections, and I'll get into that in more detail. But we talk about the paradox in the sense that it may be that older adults or anyone shares links not because they think it's true, but because for the shock value or because it's interesting. So big data that just looks at sharing might not capture all the nuances of that. Again, I'll get back to that later. So while I was doing all this work, I got in touch with Joe Kalami at the University of Chicago Press. I asked him whether he'd be interested in publishing a book that I was interested in working on, an edited methods volume. And Joe said no, but Columbia University Press thankfully was interested and did publish that book, and that was research exposed. But Joe did say, well, look, you've been doing all this work about older adults. How about a book about that? That's not so academic and more for the trade end of the press. So their academic presses publish academic books, trade books, crossovers, and this would be for trade, because to this day, there's not actually a book that looks at older adults and digital media use. There are a few books about how to use digital media, but no books about, well, what's actually happening. What do we know scientifically? And so I thought, okay, that's an interesting idea. I've never written a trade book before. I'd like to collaborate with someone on this. So I started thinking, well, who may be good for this? So John Palfrey is currently the president of the MacArthur Foundation. Formerly, he was a professor at Harvard Law School. He and I go way back in collaboration. A decade before everyone went online to teach on Zoom, John and I actually co-taught a class between Harvard Law School and Northwestern, where I was at the time, so in 2010, on methods to study internet use on video conference. So this is pre-Zoom, pre-Skype. It was like a whole decked out room. And that was a great experience, and we'd co-authored. The point is, we'd gone way back in our collaboration, and he just moved to Chicago, where I used to be, and I was thinking, okay, well, John had published a book about kids and digital media, and then he published a book about parenting and digital media. John, wouldn't your next book then be older adults and digital media? So that's how I pitched it to him, and voila, now we have this book. And just to give a little bit more about why John was interested in this. So when he became the president of the MacArthur Foundation 5 years ago, he went and looked back at the charter of the foundation. And even though they pretty much do grant making, I mean, not just grant making, they're most famous for their Genius Awards, right, the Fellows Program, but also support a lot of public media. They have internationally, they they do a lot of grant making, one of the biggest foundations. But he did look at the charter, and originally it turns out that MacArthur, the founders wanted it to be at least partly focused on retired people and their well-being. And so John thought, well, this could be an interesting project where he actually links to the original goals of the foundation. The other link to MacArthur was that one of the first projects they had sponsored was a research network on successful aging. And I'll take that note to point out that our book is very much in that more positive vein of how do we achieve success, how can people achieve successful aging with digital media. So while we reviewed the work and mentioned where there are tricky findings, overall, the goal is how can we help older adults live a better, more meaningful, successful life with digital media. So that's how the collaboration came about. Okay, so then I'd done all that interview work, and then I thought, okay, well, we also want to do survey work because we want to be able to describe bigger patterns in the population for which we need representative surveys. So just a few comments on the survey data for the project. So one was a study that I'd done separately on using survey data from just over 2,500 American adults here of 18 and over all ages, of whom a portion was 60 plus. And we need this data set to be able to compare, right? To be able to say older adults are or not different from other people, we need data on other people. And for those of you who were around 2 years ago, I gave a talk about that data set. That was the Science and Religion Project. And then thanks to a grant from MacArthur, I also collected survey data specifically about older adults and their digital media uses, which ended up being 2 surveys of 2,000 adults because the survey got to be too long, and I don't believe in administering surveys over 15 minutes due to quality purposes and cognitive load on the respondents. So I split the sample. All 4,000 got some questions, but other questions were split. I want to remind people that this is cross-sectional, not panel data, so it's descriptive, and we can't make causal arguments. And then I also like to show how much these surveys cost, because I don't think people appreciate this, especially those who are not in the social sciences, that it's not just like, oh, let's ask our friends. Like, these are really high quality surveys. And so these are the cost of just the data collection, right? None of this has to do with the staffing or anything like that. So just to give you an idea. So just some basic info, because I like to be transparent about the methods. So this was the first study. And again, just very briefly, we use weights to make sure that it is representative and doesn't bias towards certain respondents, but the weights actually barely change the distribution, which shows that the original data collection is very high quality. And the same is actually true for the other survey. Okay, so now I want to talk about generational myths. And I've already alluded to, well, I guess possibly both of these. But so one of them is that all older adults are clueless about technology, and then the other is that all young adults are necessarily savvier than older adults about technology. So for those of you who either haven't had statistics or it's been a while since you've had statistics, so a perfect correlation looks like this, right? So if X is age and Y is skill, this would mean the older you get, the more skilled you are. That's not the stereotype. The stereotype is other direction of correlation, that the older you get, the less skilled you are. Okay, so if this is what it would look like, because I'm gonna show you some graphs. I also made up some data to illustrate this. So again, x-axis age, y-axis skills, totally made up data. And for those of us who are actually like really honest researchers, this was hard. I was like, clicking away. It was just kind of weird, but this is made up. But my point is, this is what it would look like if the stereotypes were true. Sort of, this is what it would look like. And I'll say the measure of skill here is something I developed over the years, and it's been used many other times, and I could talk about it later, but it's an index measure of 5 responses to a question. And this is what the actual data look like. Okay, so here you see the trend, or I guess this way, here you don't. And like, even if you squint, that relationship is not there. And then we fit the line, barely, and that's because we have people up to like 95. But if you take people 70 and under, there's absolutely no relationship. And again, 70 is definitely older than, or 69 is definitely older than, or even 70 than what people think of as older adults. Like, people think of older adults as 60. If you're a college student, you think of 30-year-olds as older adults. I remember that from when I started teaching. Anyway, so that reality check. And then we have another measure of skill, more social, called social media skills, which is a more updated version of more recent terms. And here too, there's not a huge link. And again, if we take people 70 and under, there's not much. I mean, there's a little bit more where you now see that among older adults, there are more of them who are less skilled, but still many are very skilled. So I'm just, oh, and then another measure, which was, this was in a 2003 June survey where we had data on people of all ages. So again, this is June 23, so half a year after ChatGPT came out, so really early. So we put on a multiple choice question on the survey to see who could say what it was at the time, like how you would understand it at the time. And just under 2/3 got this right. So then let's look at what this looks like by age. And again, the stereotype would suggest a very specific direction there. But if we break it down by just kind of decades of ages, can you see that for me, or does everyone see that? Okay, so you can see that between 18 and 50s, there's absolutely no statistically significant connection. With people in their 60s, it's the knowledge does start going down, and then 70 plus it is lower. So again, challenges this stereotype. What is much more obvious is the link with education. Okay, so those who are more educated are much more likely to know what ChatGPT is. Similarly, those who have higher income are much more likely. So it's socioeconomic status that really tracks with skill, not age. And yet, so much of the public rhetoric is about age. Now, if we look at just the older adults data set where we ask the same question, you can see here a gradual decline as you go from to older and older and older. But this is partly what I was alluding to early in my talk, that there is value in disaggregating among 60 plus because the knowledge is really different. Like, you're right, like 80 plus, I'll say even there, a third of people knew. And that's also not the stereotype that an 80, 85-year-old would know what ChatGPT is, and 1 in 3 did. But that's certainly less than among the 60 to 64-year-olds, for example. And here too, even within this group, education is so much stronger a predictor or a correlate of knowing, as is financial resources. We didn't ask in the older adults data set what people's income was, since many aren't working anymore. We talked about financial resources, and so those who had fewer are the lower, less privileged ones, and they are the ones who understand ChatGPT less. So again, a very consistent story here that socioeconomic status is really what's strongly correlated with ChatGPT knowledge and ages, but not nearly as strongly. And so when looking at regression results, so where you're controlling for the different factors within one model, again, no difference under certain ages. So within the sample of adults of all ages, under 60, there's no correlation with age, but there's with education and income, even controlling for the other factors. And then similar findings for just the older adults. So I say we have debunked these myths, or I have debunked these myths for Yes.
I sort of wonder how endogenous that data is, and to give you an example, my grandma is 82, I think, but she doesn't have a computer, she doesn't have a smartphone, she doesn't go on the internet. So you wouldn't have her in your sample ever.
Exactly. She's not in my sample.
Yes. So the plots you showed are mostly people who already are on the internet.
Exactly. And we do know from other data that the vast majority of people, including older adults in the United States, are online at this point. In 23, it was 75 or 80%. Now, obviously, there's still that 25% who are not, and I should have said in the beginning that this project is not about them. So since we're interested in the details of internet use among users, we don't have data on non-users. But you're absolutely right that we have, we can't comment on the people who are non-users at all. And in some countries like Switzerland, where I live, it's even lower percentage even among the older adults, and that's definitely an issue. There, we're actually collecting data, and it's a project we started when I was here 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, where we just launched our 4th wave of data collection on the same, so it's a panel study, so it's all the same people. And there we are also collecting data on paper. So we initially contacted everyone in postal mail, and if they aren't online, we're getting their opinions about tech on paper. And so we'll have data there. So you're absolutely right in the sense that we're excluding those who are not at all online. I argue that since we know that those people are less educated, lower income on socioeconomic status measures, if anything, the findings here in relation to socioeconomic status are going to be conservative because we've missed the people who are the least privileged. Yes?
Can I ask a very related question, which is also about the population of older adults who take surveys?
Mm-hmm.
So if the data collection relies on people to be online to take this survey,
right.
I might expect that for younger adults, if these myths are true, I would expect that younger adults who take online surveys don't differ from other younger adults who are not in the population who are taking the surveys, right? So I would assume technological skills is like constant whether or not that person chooses to take the survey. But if these myths are true, then the older adults who are able to take an online survey would be fundamentally different in relation to their technological skills than the other older adults who are not taking online surveys. So is that a different way to kind of ask the previous question and like wondering, is this like representative, or does this hold for does this generalize to all older adults?
It doesn't, but I'd like to first ask you why you think that the younger adults who are taking surveys online are the same skill as younger adults who aren't.
Well, I guess given if we are assuming the myth is true, that
Right.
younger adults.
So I've tried to debunk the myth. Clearly, I've failed in your case.
Well, I'm trying to ask if it's like a chicken and egg, like.
I mean, I really feel like I've absolutely failed in convincing you that there's variation among younger adults, despite the data I've shown you. But it's true that there are people who are not online across age groups, and they are going to be less skilled than people who are online. Or there are people, young adults, who are not online as much as young adults who are, and they're likely going to be less skilled. But it is absolutely the case, same response as before, that sure, being online and being linked to a survey company does bias towards who may be, on whom we have data. But it's a similar, actually, based on research we have on who does, for example, online gig work, which is this type of work. We also know that more educated, more higher income people are more likely to do that. So again, the bias would in fact mean that our findings are conservative in terms of SES. There was a question here.
Can you say a little more about how you define skill?
Yeah, so the skill is, I mean, conceptually, the definition of skill is the ability to use technologies effectively and efficiently. And for this, I developed an instrument a while ago about it could be a whole other talk, which is why I don't get into it in a lot of detail here, but it's a question, it's a survey question. I'll show you what it is. But then I want to get back to other things. So, so this is the question, and you're gonna poke all sorts of holes at this potentially, which is fine. I have 3 publications just about the survey item. I mean, survey items is like a whole research field too. It's both an art and a science. And again, this has performed well over time across countries. It's been used in hundreds of papers. And then these would be the general internet use terms, and then the social media ones are somewhat different. And one of the papers, which isn't one of the 3 I cited, we showed that so many skill items, for example, bias by gender. So women are consistently will rate themselves lower skilled than men. But this measure is less prone to that bias than simply asking people, for example, what they think their skill is. And something like the multiple choice question, and then I'm going to stop because truly this could be a whole other lecture, but the multiple choice question, I will share this for those of you who work on surveys. Another gender bias, one way to avoid it is you never want to have, especially in the case of a skill question, a don't know option, because women are more likely to choose that even if their knowledge is the same. So, so I've very carefully worked on avoiding those kinds of gender bias measures with skill instruments and other issues. There was a hand up there.
Yeah, so it was also related to skills, but did you have like new AI technologies in your?
Did I have what?
AI technologies, like you asked like what ChatGPT is, but did you ask how they use it or something like that? Because like it might be the case that older people are slower in adapting, getting savvier.
It might be. So I'll remind you, I collected these data in 2023. So the answer is no. That said, so I've given talks related to this for over 20 years here at CITP. And every time people will say, oh, but it's the time, it's now, it's da-da-da-da. And these things are surprisingly consistent over the years. So especially these relationships of variables. So certain things change over time. Like, of course, the skill you have today, what makes you skilled today is not the same that made you skilled when I gave a talk here in, say, 2005. But the relationships of these variables to sociodemographic factors is remarkably consistent over time, and again, consistent often across countries, as many colleagues have done research elsewhere. Okay, so I don't know, there are other questions, but I also want to finish up. So I'm going to keep going with the talk and then hold your questions on, happy to take your questions then. So I wanted to, and until when should I be talking, by the way? Or when is the session till?
The session is until 1:15, totally
Quarter
up to you how you
after.
want to pick your time.
So, yeah, I just want to get through all the slides and then we'll go back. So I wanted to talk a little bit about social media adoption, because that's another area where there are a lot of assumptions about how older adults are not nearly as active. And so I also want to talk about this. Let me get rid of this thing. You can't see this, but should hide full meeting controls. Okay, that should help. So I'm going to relate this to a whole other conversation and research out there, which is big data, which a lot of people use in their research. And but a savvy Princeton student might ask whether better is always better when it comes to data. And so I ask this because, as I will show, there are biases in data that we grab from social media, which are often the basis of lots of big data studies. And so that's just another area where we have to be careful. Okay, so from the June survey, where we have data on adults of all ages, we find that Facebook and Pinterest adoption is not different depending on whether someone is under or over 60 or 60. But for the other platforms that we included, and these are the most popular platforms, there are age differences. I will make a special mention of Pinterest, which continues to be a very popular platform and continues to be completely ignored by academics, just saying. Okay. When we control, so the next question was whether people have posted, shared, commented, or whether they do post, share, comment on these platforms. If we restrict that analysis to people who are on these platforms, so just for each respectively, what we find is that in 5 out of the 8 cases, there's no difference between being an older adult or under 60 in terms of being actively engaged on the platform. So again, I think a helpful reality check where you might think older adults, they don't really know what they're doing, they're just kind of looking and scrolling or whatever. No, they're also posting and sharing, and there could be different reasons for this. One could be that, you know, those of them who are retired probably have more time, and but so it's just, again, the point is to make you think more carefully about assumptions about people at different ages. So now back to the data set that's only about older adults. So again, this is the distribution of social media use among them. And back to the point that yes, this was collected online and it was collected from people who are in a panel. So it's not necessarily representative of all internet users, although in terms of demographics, it is representative of the country, older adults in general in the country. And based on the results of regression, so again, where we control for the different factors, and for age, the base category here is purposefully, I made it the middle category, so 70 to 74. As you can see that the younger older adults are much more likely to be on the platforms, and the oldest are less. They're not that huge differences between 65 and 79 though. Women are more likely to be on some, men on others. And again, education is huge, right? The more educated, the more likely you are to be on these platforms almost universally, except for Facebook, where it doesn't matter, and TikTok, where more educated is less likely to be around. And then separately, those who are more skilled are more likely to be on platforms. Again, this is cross-sectional. I can't draw a causal argument. You could say if you're using platforms more, you're more skilled. I did do a study years earlier where I had panel data over time and could say that your skills at time 1 actually predicted your propensity to adopt platforms later, but that was a different age group. Just to remind you, part of the reason I'm sharing this is to think about when you get data from social media platforms as your data set to ask some question that has nothing to do with digital media, recognize that you have a biased sample, that you're either missing men or you're missing women, depending on where you're getting the sample. You're definitely missing people who are less educated, et cetera. Just something to keep in mind. Totally different thing, and this is more just, I'm not gonna talk about this too much, but social media, these are some interesting little data points. Social media get critiqued a lot about all the negative that they relate to. And so I decided to ask a question about the kinds of feelings that people have had using social media. And so I had 4 negative type, 4 positive types. These were presented in randomized order to the different respondents, and this is what we got. So you can see that the positive ones are much more likely the kinds of feelings that people report, or these older adults report, although 40% say none of this. But overall, so just over a fifth listed something negative and over half listed something positive. This,
Just quick clarifying, this is older adults or is this?
yeah, this is the older adult sample, yeah. I will link this to something we talk about in the adoption chapter, the first chapter after the intro, which is that one of our findings is that older adults are really good about leaving platforms that aren't serving their needs. And we wonder if this may be partly about that, right? So if it's because of life changes, often it's related to family, where family members are. Like some people will talk about, well, I started using WhatsApp because my grandkids were abroad, but they came back, I don't need it anymore. Older adults seem much better at moving on from platforms, whereas it seems that other age groups, I don't know if it's because of FOMO or what it is, fear of missing out, but may not be as good about leaving platforms. And so I think this shows an interesting agency on the part of older adults. Did you have a question, Jenna?
I did have a question, if we have a second. This explains a lot about me going to my mom and being like, get off, and she's like, but I like it. And so actually I wondered, because one of the things that might be happening is if they're connecting more with people they already care about, that they already have really powerful relationships with. So I was wondering if you had any data, and we could talk about this later, about who it is they're actually connecting with on those platforms, and if it's different than this kind of like, they're not, are they doing the big, like, I'm following all these like influencers on Instagram and like, oh my god, my body image is terrible, or they're like, I got my knitting circle.
Yeah, so I don't have it at the level of knitting circle, but I actually do, and it's very rare data we have, but I ended up taking out those slides today. So
Let's discuss that. 'Cause that
yeah,
actually
happy
could be
to, and I
like-
can.
Maybe young people should be learning from how old people use it.
There are all sorts of things young people can learn from
Yeah,
older
that would be
people.
good.
Absolutely.
That'd be good.
I'll look for, while we do the Q&A, I'll look for those slides, because I did just take them out, just for time. Okay, so let me talk about misinformation more directly. So a few years ago, there was a lot of coverage that Andy Guess, who's here in political science, and his colleagues, his co-authors, Jonathan Nagler and Josh Tucker, got in the press about a study they had. Now, this is about not their findings, this is about how I think journalists completely botched the reporting about their findings. So this was the title of their paper, and I'm assuming at least some of you are familiar with this, but just very briefly, so it's a really wonderful paper where they have data, like log data from Facebook on what people are sharing, and they have survey data about those people, and they were able to link those data, and so see age, gender, partisanship of who's sharing news items that tend to be associated with fake news sites. Their title says less than you think. This is their title, and there's not a word in the title about age. And less than you think, they found that 8.5% of Americans were sharing fake news. That's nothing compared to the rhetoric you hear, right? About everyone, like, oh, there's fake news everywhere. Okay, they also found that even among those who shared, the majority, over half, only shared once, okay? And a super tiny minority shared multiple times fake news kinds of items. But they have the following graph also in their paper. Okay, average number of fake news shares by age. And so even though overall this is tiny, like it's under 1 for every age group, this is the finding that journalists ran with. And I'll say as a point, the Washington Post piece they wrote, but I checked with Andy and I know this because I've also, written in the Post and elsewhere that they were not responsible for the title. And their piece is very level-headed, but the titles are ridiculous. And so this is a critique of journalism, and to please stop sensationalizing age, because it's not there and it's very annoying. Because it really does, like it really shortchanges older adults, and it just, as I said, it's lost opportunities, partly for younger adults to learn from older adults. And overall, this isn't even reflected in other data. So one of the things we talk about in the book is that the FBI has found that older adults are actually less likely to fall for scams than younger adults. Surprised? Many older adults do fall for scams. Statistically, they're less likely. So why are there more older adults in the aggregate who fall for scams? They're the ones who have money, so that's who scammers target, okay? but statistically, they're still less likely to fall for them. This reminds us of the famous, notorious criminal Willie Sutton, who when asked why he robs banks, said, well, that's where the money is. Okay? So similarly, scammers go after older adults because it's not very exciting to get the $50 out of the 18-year-old's bank account, right? It's more exciting to get the $50,000 or $500,000 from the older adults. But statistically speaking, controlling for being targeted, older adults are less likely to fall for scams. Another data point. In my book, Connected in Isolation, which we had a lovely book lunch event for here when it came out in 2022, one of the things I found was that older adults were less likely to fall for misinformation about COVID. They were a vulnerable population. It was important for them to know what's going on. And I had data from 3 countries, and in 2 out of 3 countries, the older you were, the more you knew about COVID, controlling for a host of other factors. And even where it wasn't linked in Switzerland, it still wasn't negatively linked. Okay, so absolutely no evidence of the idea that older adults are worse with getting the right information. So this is me debunking this idea that older adults are necessarily left and right falling for bad information, or that they're doing so more than younger adults. So to wrap up, a few takeaways. Adults of all ages vary in their digital skills, whether I've managed to convince you or not. Some older adults are very skilled. I mean, think about it. Again, as I said, you were 45 when it took off. I mean, why wouldn't you be skilled? You've been doing it for 20, 25 years. Education and income are more important than age. It's not as easy, a thing to write about as a journalist, I guess. It's easier to just say seniors suck. But it's really, it's more complicated to say our society is shortchanging those who are less privileged. Many older adults are active on social media. They are often better at avoiding misinformation than younger ones. So for journalists, please stop sensationalizing coverage of older adults and digital media in terms of how bad they are. I didn't talk about this in detail, but I mentioned support, and I just want to say that support we found is usually best at earlier stages of technology adoption and needs to be given respectfully and patiently. This isn't shocking, but it really comes through the interviews that people who are giving support should be respectful and patient. And older adults can be themselves helpful sources of support. And technology companies ignore older adults at their peril. We say this partly because, again, back to this idea, older adults are the ones who actually have money, right? They have money to spend, and they would be happy to spend it on technology, except technology companies usually ignore them. And so they seem like a completely untapped market share for tech companies. Okay, so I'll wrap it up there, and I'm happy to answer questions. Okay, so you had your hand up, and then Manuel, and then I'll get everyone else. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. I was really appreciative of the talk. I had a question with regards to actually within age brackets, if you looked at socioeconomic status and education status and saw if maybe younger people or sort of middle-aged people, if there was a shift in sort of adoption of technology or skill set within that. So were less educated young people more at the same rates, basically less knowledgeable as technology as older or middle-aged, less educated people, if that makes sense.
I think I'm following. Wait, so to recap, are you saying that a less educated younger adult may be less skilled than a more educated older adult?
No. Within their age brackets, did you see similar distributions when if you controlled for an age bracket, so controlling for let's say 18 to 30 and then also 60 to 75, did you see a similar sort of, if you then look at specifically income or specifically education, did you see similar trends for?
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So I shared the one with just older adults, and there we have a trend. I guess I haven't separately run 18 to 29 in education. I could do that. But I mean, generally the regressions I feel like if the trend wasn't similar, there would be the relationship wouldn't be as clear as it is,
Okay.
but I could certainly look at that.
Yeah, just interesting.
See
Thank
sort
you.
of what the gradient is compared, sure. Yes,
In general, when you're doing survey with older adults, especially if they go like beyond 80, like my question is like, is there any sense in which like measurement error increases just out of like, you know, kind of like people are, for instance, have some sort of difficulty, like harder to understand the question or something like this. When you're doing this surveying towards older adults and they become fairly old, I guess there's just a higher chance that like there'll be more measurement error in the survey. Is this something that people think about in survey research when you're?
I'm sure people do who actually, so I should say there's a whole separate field of survey research as a field of research, right?
Yeah.
Like, I would say, so cognitive decline happens to some older people. I would say, again, they're probably less likely to be in the data set because they're probably not taking surveys. That said, there are plenty of 80-plus-year-olds who are still very cognitively astute. So I don't, and cognitive decline can happen at any age. I don't know of the literature on this.
But it is more so that like if anyone, let's just say that anyone has at any point a chance of like messing up an attention check, because like or like if you think that you know the answer to one of your knowledge questions, there's some sort of like attention check, right? Like have you carefully considered the options well enough to click what you know, right? And my question is like, is there a way of knowing this through age? You know, like could you,
on the point of attention checks, we have a separate attention check question. We have a question that's only about attention check, that's not measuring anything else. So if someone was really not with it, they would get that wrong, and then they're out of the sample.
I see.
And that's just another general point for anyone doing surveys. You should always have at least one attention check question. And it's basically like, we're interested in making sure that people are following the question wording carefully. For this question, please choose number 3. And then it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you're out if you don't choose 3, that kind of thing. It's a whole thing too. There's a whole separate literature just on attention check questions. Okay, so I think it was you, and then you, and then you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. If I understand like one of your arguments correctly, it's that age is not as strongly correlated with internet skill as things like socioeconomic status or education level. I'm really curious, in your data set, did you observe that there's strong covariance between age and socioeconomic status and age and education level? Because maybe this is like a myth that I believe, but aren't people of like higher socioeconomic status more likely to live to like an older age than?
That is absolutely right. Again, the weights should take care of this because our weights are based on age and education, and then gender and race ethnicity, which by the way are also correlated with how long people live. And so I think the weights would take care of this. I doubt that those differences are so strong as to show up at that level at a sample of this size, but I'm not sure. It's an interesting point, for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. This was a very fun presentation. I guess going back to Janet's question a little bit, I think you've done a great job of convincing me that maybe older adults are not using the internet badly.
I mean, some are,
Yeah.
just like some young adults are
Maybe not
using
as
it
much as
badly.
The myths would have you think. I'm curious if there are stories or things that you've learned about how they might use the internet in inspiring in different ways or in ways that are aspirational.
Yeah, so this is the learning chapter, which I said is my favorite, and I think because it's all about like the cool things people can do, and the way I've conceptualized skill is that at the very core level, it's about awareness of what is possible online. And so I think for a lot of people, including and maybe especially older adults in this case, often what's lacking is an awareness of what you can actually do online. That would be helpful, that would be interesting, right? So for those of us who are quite familiar with the internet, we know that no matter your hobby, your interest, your topic, truly no matter how niche, there will be a community or 100 online about it. But it may be that older adults and other people as well don't realize that. And then if you don't realize it, you're not seeking it out. And we have all sorts of examples in the learning chapter, maybe even in the mental health chapter, I'm not sure, or the well-being chapter, about people sometimes getting help for that. So one way to help older adults is in fact to help them find these online communities that may be relevant for them, like find how their hobby is represented online, things like that. Yeah. So you're next, and then you.
Thanks, this was a really interesting and surprising talk.
The results might surprise you.
Yes, they did surprise me. And I think in particular, like what's really helpful about it is that it reminded me that as much as there's a moral panic around children and the internet, there's a parallel moral panic about old people and the internet. And so to think in a more rigorous, data-driven way about addressing real harms without being paternalistic and patronizing is helpful. But I was curious if you, in the time since your data gathering ended for the book, have you thought about how ChatGPT and generative AI more generally might change the picture for the vulnerabilities of certain segments of the population, whether we say that those should be identified based on age or socioeconomic and educational status? How do you think that changes the landscape?
Yeah, so we do talk about this a little bit in the book, and there is evidence, but not, I mean, there hasn't been research to say if the evidence is related to age or education even, because very educated people have been known to fall for scams as well through AI, but that, there's like, it's a whole other ballgame, and what's gonna happen is kind of an open question. I think this is potentially gonna affect everyone though. It's a good question of whether those who are more educated might be better at learning preemptive measures faster or something like that. We don't know this yet. I think it's too soon, but we do share all sorts of anecdotes. Again, not just about older adults at all though. And then I'll say that we are now in my group just launching, we just started interviewing last week older adults about their Gen AI experiences specifically. But that's gonna be, I mean, that's not a representative sample, but we're interviewing again with the goal of having a survey next year about that topic. Okay, so you, and then I guess you have your hand up again. Yeah.
So I think ever since I was in middle school, it feels like I've been helping my mom and, you know, my mom's friends and in different types of, you know, tech issues and so on. And it feels almost like at some point an universal lived experience for me and my peers that, you know, we're sort of like tech support for our parents and our friends' parents. And I think a lot of people potentially, maybe I'm assuming here, can relate to that. But what I'm hearing you say is that it may be less so because there's a skill gap. Perhaps is it because help-seeking practices are different and I'm less likely to go to my mom and her friends for help, or my friends are less likely to do that, but they are more willing to come for help from me and my peers? Is that potentially how to interpret this? It's not so much about the skill gap, but
some of it. So first of all, I will say that you're someone who's at Princeton, you're not the average your age person, right? And so we don't know how people who are in your age cohort, who are not nearly as educated, or not in a CITP context, how good they are with technology and are they able to offer the tech help that their parents need. We don't know that. That's one. Another is, again, just to answer the question about you particularly, I mean, you're surrounded by all these people, even just in this room, who probably also know a ton. So you don't need to really go to outsiders to get help. If you need help, you could probably get it locally. But yes, there is generally the idea of seeking help not being the kind of thing that, so this is again why I think the public rhetoric shortchanges everyone, that because we're constantly telling younger people that they're so savvy with it, I don't think younger people think that there might be anything they don't know that maybe they should get help with. And so they don't realize, well, I'm falling for this scam, how could I avoided that, or, because, again, if you're hearing all the time that you're so good, then it's not totally shocking that you don't feel like you should go to someone for help. So I think it's many things, yeah, yes.
Thank you for shattering our stereotypes, and I have like sort of a question, and maybe it's also like a call for further study, because I think you sort of talked about like how older people like seek out, that's what you studied, right? Like sort of seek out internet and other things online, and what is on the other side when folks are forced to use AI or other things. So I'm thinking about, like, I studied AI and hiring and AI in the workplace, and there's a whole shift to more algorithmic tools, and we know very little about how age plays into that. Like, we know, like, from sociological studies, obviously, that age discrimination does exist in employment, but we actually don't know how that plays out in this new world. I don't know if you know anything about this, or maybe it's a call for you to further study that as well if you're looking for new things.
Oh, you mean like specifically in the employment domain?
As we see maybe older people, trying to be lifelong learners and like trying to stay employed longer, or maybe there's also an economic need to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, so the short answer is no, I haven't studied this, but I think, in part, this is tricky. Oh, I guess we're out of time, but, sure, let me just answer this and then, okay. So this is I will say this is a very American perspective, which is where we are, that like in Europe, most people retire when they're 65, it's almost legally required. Like I will stop being a professor at 65 because that's how long my contract is, even though I have tenure. And so that doesn't mean we can't study it, obviously, but there probably is an economic angle to it anyway, because it's the people who are less privileged who would have the need to be working into their 70s. But no, the short answer is I haven't studied it, and I agree that it's a fascinating area for sure. Okay, so go ahead and.
Thank you, Professor Hargittai, again, I'm sure